Hello, in this video I will explain the biological and psychological factors of hearing. The senses are typically divided into two categories, sensation and perception. So with hearing, the ear, the inner ear actually, converts sound waves into neural signals that are sent to the brain. Neural signals are electrical and chemical. And then the brain does a process called perception. This means the brain then interprets those signals and organizes them to make sounds and language and music and so on. Hearing, just like any of the senses, requires 4 steps. Number 1, you have to have a physical stimulus. Well, for hearing, that would be sound waves. Number 2, you have to have a receptor in your body that will change the physical stimulus into neural signals, electrical chemical signals in your nervous system. The little mechanisms in your body that do this are called receptors, and the process is called transduction, changing a physical stimulus to a neural stimulus. Then third, we have sensation. That is the feeling that you have. I hear something, I see something, I smell something, and so on. And then fourth is the perception. What is it that I hear? Oh, it's a saxophone. There are 4 properties of sound that your brain has to perceive. One is, how loud is it? We call this the intensity. Secondly, the pitch. That's the frequency of the sound waves. Third, the timbre or color. That means like a saxophone sounds different than a banjo. My voice sounds different than your voice, and so on. And then fourth, the location. Where is the sound coming from? Here is an illustration that shows the ear. We have on the far left, the outer ear, which is called the pinna. It has a shape that will help sound waves go into the ear canal. And there is the eardrum, scientifically called the tympanic membrane, which vibrates with sound when sound waves enter. And that vibration is picked up by 3 little bones in the middle ear. And those bones vibrating will magnify the vibration, which is then passed on to an organ in the inner ear called the cochlea, which has hair cells that will change those vibrations into electrical signals that get sent through the auditory nerve to the brain. Here's another illustration of the human ear. Sound waves, which are vibrations, go through the ear canal and vibrate the eardrum. That vibrates the middle ear, where there are 3 bones, 3 little tiny bones that send the vibration and magnify it into the cochlea, which is that snail spiral-shaped organ which has the hair cells which change the sound waves into electrical signals. Here's a good illustration of the middle ear, where we have the 3 little bones called ossicles, the malleus or hammer, the incus or anvil, and the stapes or the stirrup. So what happens is these 3 little bones in the middle part of the ear magnify the vibrations coming into the eardrum by 10-fold, and then send the signal through what is called the oval window into the cochlea, and the cochlea then transduces, changes those vibrations into electrical signals that go to the brain. In this illustration, we see the sound waves, the vibrations, being passed from the stapes into the cochlea by using the oval window. And then below the oval window, there's another little window called the round window that vibrates in reverse in order to allow the fluid to move within the cochlea. So the cochlea has a spiral shape, and the fluid moves in there, stimulates cells that creates an electrical signal that travels to the brain through the auditory nerve. Here we see an illustration of the cochlea, which has a spiral shape. And in the inner ear, attached to the cochlea, are the semicircular canals, which have really nothing to do with hearing. They are used for balance. Inside the cochlea are hair cells that are stimulated by the fluid that moves as the vibrations come into the cochlea. Inside the cochlea, The part of the ear that actually does the transduction of sound waves into electrical signals is called the organ of Corti, because it's named after the Italian scientist who in 1851 described this mechanism. This is where we find the hair cells that are going to change the vibrations into electrical signals that will be sent to the brain. We could call the organ of Corti the body's microphone. The organ of Corti sits on top of the basilar membrane, which vibrates up and down, moves up and down when sound waves come through the organ of Corti, and that's where the hair cells are. And those hair cells get triggered and send signals to the brain. And here again, we see another illustration of how sound waves get changed into neural signals and sent to the brain. And then on the left, an illustration showing the arrangement of hair cells in the spiral-shaped cochlea. And the hair cells are arranged according to pitch. So high-pitched sounds are heard in one part of the cochlea, the organ of Corti, and then low-pitched in another area. Some people have hearing impairment because their biological system is not functioning right. They're not getting the sound waves to their brain. And so one solution is called a cochlear implant, which is brain surgery, really, in which device is implanted into the cochlea to help send these signals to the brain. A microphone is placed next to the ear and a computer that translates sound waves. There are many thousands of people who have cochlear implants, although this is rather controversial because some people in the deaf community do not feel that deafness is a disability. They feel it's just a difference, like being left-handed, and that you shouldn't have a cochlear implant. But this girl seems very happy to have her cochlear implant. Okay, another quick summary of how sound waves reach your brain. Vibrations enter the ear canal. They vibrate the eardrum, which vibrates the bones of the inner ear, which sends the vibration into the cochlea, which has this organ of Corti, which translates using hair cells, what we call transduction, changes the sound waves into neural signals, electrical signals that travel through the auditory nerve to the brain. Next, we will consider the auditory pathway, that is, the auditory nerve bringing signals into the brain, first starting at the brainstem and then going up to the thalamus and then going to the auditory area. So we're going to look at that next. The place in the brain that does the perception of sounds is called the primary auditory cortex and is located in the middle of the very top part of the temporal lobe. It's really located actually in the lateral fissure, the place where the brain cortex kind of folds in on itself. This is the primary auditory cortex that translates sounds into hearing, what we hear. The primary auditory cortex was studied the most by a scientist named Richard Heschel. So sometimes this little bump in the top of the temporal lobe is called Heschel's gyrus. Gyrus just means a bump in the brain, and that's where we find the primary auditory cortex. But before the auditory signal gets up into the cerebral cortex, it first goes to the brain stem where important information is calculated. That is, your brain knows something about the sound before you do. In other words, there's unconscious processing that goes on in the brainstem before, a split second before you hear the sound, your brain knows something about the sound. What does your brain know about a sound before you do? It knows the location of the sound, where that sound is coming from, and it knows the pitch of the sound. Is it a high pitch? Is it a low pitch? This information is calculated in the brain stem in certain areas. For example, location is calculated in an area called the superior olive or the olivary complex, and pitch is interpreted in the inferior colliculus. The electrical signal from the ears, the auditory pathway, goes first to the brainstem where some information is calculated, like the location of the sound, the pitch of the sound, and then the electrical signal travels up to the thalamus, which is the relay center, routing center in the brain for sensory information. The thalamus then sends the information to the auditory cortex, which is in the temporal lobe, both on the left and the right. And as you can see from this illustration, that the hearing is contralateral, that is, the left ear is sending information to the right hemisphere, the right ear is sending information to the left hemisphere, but it's also ipsilateral, that is, left ear sends signals to left hemisphere, right ear sends signals to right hemisphere, but a little more contralateral, that is, a little more information goes to the opposite hemisphere from the ear. The auditory cortex is where this sound is perceived. Oh, that's a saxophone playing, or that's my mother's voice, or whatever your brain perceives to be the sound. Sound waves have two physical properties that the brain uses to interpret the sound. One is the height of the sound wave, that's called the amplitude, and brain uses that to interpret the loudness of the sound. And secondly is the distance apart between the waves, that's called wavelength, and the brain uses that information to determine how high the pitch is or how low the pitch is, so the pitch of the sound. And then third, sound waves are always complex, they're never pure, and the complexity of the sound waves is used by the brain to determine what is called the timbre. That means the quality or the color of the sound. So my voice sounds different than someone else's voice, or a saxophone sounds different than a tuba. Even if a saxophone and tuba are playing the same note, same pitch, at the same loudness, we still can tell a difference. That's called timbre. The amplitude, the height of the sound wave, tells the brain the loudness. The wavelength tells the brain the pitch of the sound. The wavelength of a sound wave is indicated by a number called a hertz, named after the scientist Heinrich Hertz, who studied sound waves. And so the hertz tells us the number of cycles per second. So if a sound wave is vibrating, let's say 2,000 times per second, the brain will interpret that as a certain pitch. When the wavelength is short, the distance between waves is short, that means there's a lot of waves per second, a high hertz. That's high frequency sound. We hear that as a high pitch. And when there are long wavelengths, there's long distance between the waves, that's a low frequency sound. That brings us to the end of this video about hearing. I hope to really helped you understand the process. It's amazing, all of these sensory systems that we have, and please watch more of my videos on my channel, Brucey. I'm Psychology Professor Bruce Hinrichs. Thanks for watching. Bye.